Hello and welcome to the Delhi Book Fair 2021. On behalf of Orange Publishers, this is Shantheri here, and it's my extreme pleasure to welcome you to the panel discussion today. Orange Publishers is a leading premier publishing house in Calcutta and has given voice to many established and young authors. So over the next 45 minutes, like yesterday, we are going to have a couple of distinguished panelists joining us, sharing their views on diametrically different themes, and we hope you have great takeaways with their diverse perspectives. But before I introduce our first guest on the panel, it's my pleasure to welcome back Bushra Hussain, who's a young, enthusiastic author, onto today's session. Bushra, welcome. Thank you for joining in as a special guest and commentator. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
So for the record, Bushra has spent some of her time during the pandemic very productively and has debuted as an author. And she's written a title which is very arresting, you know, the title of her debut book, Wild Hearts Can't Be Broken. Is that right, Bushra? Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Very intriguing. So when I got to know the title, I thought I should look it up. So congratulations on that. And thank you for joining in.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yes. So the first theme for today's session is going to be around the past, present, and the future of short stories. Very thematical for a prestigious book fair of this nature. And the person to be co-leading the discussion with us today is Mr. Souvik Maiti. A little about the author himself, very distinguished profile. Let me kind of present him to the audiences here. He's the author of the recent bestseller, Ekalavya Athapur, which is an anthology of 10 Bengali short stories. He interestingly uses the pen name of Kuhoki for his short stories. Very interesting. Merits a little more discussion. And in his own words, his stories give full rein to his interest in the macabre, suspense, history, and such other varied interests which make the books unputdownable. Now, the stories in his book often deal with complex human emotions, universality, and are of deceptive simplicity, sometimes culminating to revenge and often having an interesting twist at the end. And he also says the readers will learn a lot through his simple stories, which will be value adding basically, and will help ignite their imagination and thought process. Very interesting again. And he's an IIT graduate in electronics engineering. And Souvik's day job comprises of business management and leadership in a leading MNC. Interesting combinations here. An avid traveler who has lived in multiple countries for work and leisure. His writings are reflective of his experiences. And other than his favorite short story genre, Souvik also writes essays and travelogues. His hobbies also include painting, and the illustrations in his book are sketched by him. Very, very interesting, lovely, revelations about an author. It's my honor to be introducing him and to be leading this discussion. A warm welcome to you, Souvik. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Santheri, for the wonderful introduction. And I'm equally excited and delighted to be part of this session. And by the way, I suddenly see there is a story unfolding already, because I now realize that my name in this session is Isha Maiti, which is actually my daughter's name, and she uses this for her online classes. And right. I usually don't use this as my Zoom ID, and suddenly now I realize I didn't change my name. So whether it's Kuhoki or Isha, I think I'll never get into my name when I come into present. That's the story unfolding.
Yeah, that's interesting. You know, the pseudonyms or the pen names are the interesting part of the hidden author, you know.
I just realized.
Great point. So Souvik, let me open the discussion further on to what you just said. Your book on the 10 stories is a bestseller currently and, for the days to come. Why did you choose short stories as a genre among so many other forms of literature that are open to us? And since today the top topic or the theme is about the past of short stories, can you help us with some insight about what you perceive as the evolution of short stories, how it all started, so on and so forth? So opening the discussion, all yours.
Thanks. I think a great question. So why short story, right? I remember the great American short story writer, William Faulkner. I think he got the Nobel Prize in literature sometime around 1949. He once suggested that writers often try their hand at poetry, find it too difficult, go on to the next most demanding form, the short story, fail at that, and then only they settle for a novel. That for sure is debatable. I write short stories because I love to read them myself. See, a large part of our life is spent with the magic of stories, either reading them, uh, listening to them, or even looking at screen adaptations. I remember a writer once said, real life has no plot. Well, in stories, ordinary real life, for that matter, fantasy even, is taken by the storyteller, given a shape and meaning, which is appealing, and then it is thus presented, which makes it a good read. When I used to live in US, I once heard Kip Fadiman, the radio personality, demonstrating the shortest story ever told. It goes like this. In the room sat the last human being on earth. There was a knock at the door, and the story ends. You see, it ends with a lot of possibilities, leaves the reader with a gamut of imagination. It can be scary, it can have a nervous laugh as well, but that is too short. A short story should be long enough to grab your attention for some time and short enough to be finished at one sitting. Probably, that is the best definition that you could put to a short story. You ask about the evolution of short story. Well, every country has a pioneer. Goethe, or Goethe, as they call him, the German novelist, he defined short story as an event that has occurred. Then there is the impressionist short story writers who focuses on impressions registered by events in characters' mind. In Anton Chekhov's stories, nothing happens, but he speaks a lot about the characters. And then there is Pirandello from Sicily, Kafka from Prague, of course, our O. Henry, Guy de Maupassant from France, all stalwarts in their crafts. The Russian short story writers are a type of their own. In fact, Fyodor Dostoevsky once said that all short story writers emerged from Gogol's overcoat. Of course, a pun intended for the great short story writer, Nikolai Gogol. Edgar Allan Poe, who is credited to have started the modern short story format in US, believed that it should have a compact, unified effect. Today, many short story writers do not obey this exactly, but they too must have a plot. Then there are characters, conflict, style. So together, the plot, the form, characters, conflict, style comprises of a short story. In India, Rabindranath Tagore was credited to start the short story format in Bengali. I think it was as early in 1877, when he was just about 16 years old, he wrote Bhikarini, which translates to as the beggar woman. And then there was Munshi Premchand. Satyajit Ray himself has adapted two of the Premchand stories into movies. Sadgati, the Satranj Ki Khiladi. By the way, Ray himself was a great storyteller, right? Great short story writer. So he wrote mostly for children, but his stories had layers which was appealing to all generations. I think the only story that he wrote for adult generation, you may say, was the life and death of Arya Shekhar. I think that was way back in 70s, 1968, around that time. So other than that, even his other stories, which are generally meant for young population, is actually traversing across the generation. And recently, while we celebrate his 100 years of birth centenary, a web series was formed called Ray, right? Where four directors came together, and then there was a ensemble of the different short stories. So you asked about the evolution, the short stories that has evolved from Edgar Allan Poe's time, all through Gogol, O. Henry, Maupassant, and our very own Tagore and Premchand and Ray. That's quite an evolution.
Absolutely. I mean, it's very intriguing here. There's so much that, you kind of brought out from the past that really gave me goosebumps. all the legendary references that we grew up reading. And I think every language other than the English language has been rich in its own tradition of short stories. You know, if you really see, you mentioned Premchand, and there were many other writers in Hindi as well, Mohan Rakesh, and so many others, you know, who kind of really brought in the rich flavor. And of course, down south as well, a lot of flavors of good writers who brought a lot of meaning into the format of short storytelling. So let me take this a little further, Souvik. So your short stories also have a twist at the end generally. So how much do surprises act in the success of the short story format? And what is the present form of short stories changing in its shape, form, and structure? Over to you.
All right. I see twists at the end, of course, has a rereading effect, if you know what I mean. So, of course, O. Henry, Guy de Maupassant were masters of this craft. The whole motivation for the turnaround ending, I think Saki used to beautifully call it as the sting in the tail, has a surprise factor. When everything is familiar, readers feel in control. The twist is there to provide that surprise. Its job is to jolt the tale into life. Many of the readers would have read about the gift of the Magi or the necklace. In the first, a young couple, Jim and Della, starts professing love for each other with their modest means. The story is set in Christmas, but not until the very end of the story, the reader is privy to the surprise. And when the twist unfolds, the reader is tempted to reread all over again. Similarly, in the necklace, Matilda's sorry state in losing the borrowed necklace builds up tension through the climax. And the quirky ending makes it wonder how sublime life is and how shallow the material pursuits are. See, for me, the thriller is all-time favorite genre, whether I'm reading a book or watching a screenplay. So in my recent book of short stories, there are a few of them which has twists in the end. I'm sure those stories have a rereading value where you try to identify where the author has left hints of that surprise ending earlier in the story, or there has been misses to it. You know what I mean? So of course, yes, in my book, I have kept certain short stories with certain twists in there. And I love that style of writing, actually.
Sure. So any example that you can give without revealing too much? Any one example, short example, very quickly.
Okay, so there is this story. I'll tell you about this title story, Eklavya Atapar, which says about an artist. Apparently, he writes, he paints with his name as Eklavya. And then there is a famous artist, even more famous, all right? His name is, he signs his pictures as Nemo, but his actual name is a little longer. So he uses the initials of his names and he calls himself Nemo. And he tries to say that, okay, names are not important. No, Nemo is like no one. So he paints like that, but he is actually a very manipulative artist, all right? And suddenly he finds that there is a new artist in town who paints a lot of pictures, and his name is Eklavya, whose paintings are equally good. Only the thing is, when he paints, the bad guy, and he paints from the stories of Ramayana, Mahabharata and all, and always the bad guy has the image of this artist of Nemo, right? So why is that? I mean, every time he's showing him down, right? So let's say Hima kills Jarasandha, and that is depicted in a picture, and the face of Jarasandha resembles so much like Nemo, right? Now you can't do something about it, so he confronts this artist, and then there is a dialogue between the two in a coffee shop. What eventually comes out of that story is it's really intriguing. You have to end till the end of the story. Now, why he used to do that, and even more difficult is a state of that new painter, and why he is called Eklavya, and is there any resemblance to the Mahabharata plots and all. So there is twists and turns, and of course, thriller is some genre I like. I absolutely adore that. So I stick to that. I keep my readers guessing, and only until the end when it's revealed, and probably that has some rereading value.
So this leaves us with a lot of things to take back as to now what could have been that intriguing conversation between the two artists in the coffee shop. So interesting. You have left us with a lot to chew on, and maybe order the book immediately and post the session.
Of course.
Great, yes. So my next question to you, Souvik, immediately after this would be about, it's quite an obvious one. Who are your favorite short story writers who have influenced you and inspired you? And over time, who have been these inspirational figures? And where did you get the inspirations, typically for all your stories? Because each of it is a different genre if you really look at all of the stories, the 10 stories. So everything is so diverse. So what really kind of became the inspiration for such diversity? And which genre do you really like? You mentioned thriller. So that's an opening, but if you could just continue a bit.
Of course, of course. I think a great question. I would love to share my favorite authors and books with the audience. So I've been keeping repeating about few of the authors like O. Henry, right, and Gide Maupassant. They are stalwarts. I'm going to show you some books. So here is a book, right? O. Henry. Wonderful short story. I mean, you read through this, you keep on reading every time. It's a little dated with today's context, but it never gets old. Then there is, of course, Gide Maupassant, right? And I think long back in television, there used to be a web series called Ek Kahani, right? Where they used to adapt many of these short story format into different series. Absolutely. So again, a great book, I think, rereading material. I think another book I always go back to, I think, the collection of short stories, 51 short stories, ensemble of writers, ensemble of authors across the globe, across the board, right? Read them. One writer whom I cannot let go of is, of course, I'm a diehard fan, is Satyajit Ray, right? So this is a English translation of one of his works, right? He used to write a collection of 12 short stories together. I am such a diehard fan, I didn't want to make it 12, I made it 10 stories in my book, right? I stay a little lower than that great stalwart. So my book has 10 short story collection. He used to write 12. Another great book. Read through these books. I think they are wonderful inspiration and they have always been my influence. Of course, read through my book as well. In Bengali though, not for, a translation is yet to occur. But I think it's a nice opening. You'll have all these 10 stories, like you rightly said. They're all of different varieties, different genre. My favorite genre, of course, remains to be thriller, sure. Because, I get my inspiration from my stories from different places, right? Whereas thriller is, of course, a genre. Then there are also, of course, some emotional tales. Some are inspired for true events also. For example, I once went to the medical camp in the Sundarbans areas, all right? Where we had made some donations. We went there for a medical camp. The abject poverty that we witnessed there was beyond imagination. So that has been reflected in one of my stories. There is a story, a well-researched work on different varieties of dolls, which gives some value add to the readers. See, I want my readers to gain something. Time reading my story. You have to reward the generosity of your reader. We spoke about the past, the present of short story. I think the future of short story lies in that experimental work of mixed genres, and of course, value-adding piece of writing. Not just feel-good emotional stories, I mean, which are great, by the way, but something where the fiction and non-fiction lines get a little blurred. Let me put with an analogy. A documentary is a great, informative, value-adding piece of work, right? But to many viewers, it might not be as interesting, if not boring, as a fiction and a storyline would communicate. So in those places, if we mix stories with documentaries, it becomes an amazing material. So likewise, my idea of future short stories would be that A, it needs to depict the society, cultural, technological advancements that as a whole world we are all making. It should be innovative. For example, earlier there was horror genre, there was comedy was another genre. Now people are experimenting with horror comedy as a genre. Okay, dark humor, film noirs continue to have their place. So times are changing and stories will reflect that mood for sure. As I said, Edgar Allan Poe's definition of short story doesn't hold good today. People are experimenting a lot. So yes, my favorite genre is thriller, but then I keep experimenting and go a larger extent around that.
Yeah, that was very insightful. I mean, as to, I don't think there is a constancy to anything, leave alone, writing. And you rightly pointed out, for the times when we were like reading Poe's stories, Edgar Allan Poe's stories, I mean, they were hair raising. Some of it was like unexplainable as to how the human mind worked. I remember a
Of
particular
course.
story of somebody getting trapped in an entire closed ceiling house. I think it was a form of revenge.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
was a revenge story, and so on and so
Mhm.
forth. So I think we've come a long way. We have built layers on that, and
Mhm.
I'm sure there's a fluidity to people who are creatively expressive. And it could even range from the macabre to the simplistic and to the idealist and altruist. It could go
And science
anywhere.
fiction also, maybe a little bit of science fiction here and there.
Absolutely, I can see a lot of the Gen Z, kind of really feeding off a lot of science fiction and fantasy, and the surreal there. There's a lot of a market there, as I can see. So that reminds me, when I talk about Gen Z, I can see Bushra wanting to ask you something here. So welcome, Bushra. Please feel free to sound out Souvik with your query.
Yeah, Maiti, your words were really inspiring for me. Like being a young author, the way your ideas are for short story, it's really inspiring. Okay, so my question for you is, it's a very short question. I won't go into details. What are you currently writing, like in this part? And second thing, I heard that you want to intend to keep your pen name as Kuhoki. So what does that mean and why is it so? Can you please tell us?
Yeah, very, very interesting question, Bushra. And first of all, let me congratulate you for your debut book. I think
Thank
you
you so
started
much.
writing pretty early. Congratulations to you. I
Thank
had
you.
started, I mean, you always used to write, but I never thought of collecting them together and putting it into a book format. I think I have to express my gratitude to Orange Publishers for doing that and
Of
suggesting me
course.
that I put it in a book format because they thought it had a potential. So congratulations, Bushra, on
Thank you. Thank you.
to start early. Um, yeah, so thriller is a favorite genre that we have established. Right now, what I'm writing is I'm currently writing a novel in English, which is a thriller again, but that's set in the backdrop of World War II. So it has a non-linear storytelling. It starts somewhere in 1940s, jumps back to present in 2019, goes back in 1984, comes back to present, etc. So a very non-linear storytelling. Of course, a lot of twists and turns. And another genre which intrigues me is the revenge plot, right? Um, Much like Quentin Tarantino's movie, revenge is best served when it's hot. So it's interesting how things take place. I think history has a strong connection to these stories and in this bigger novel to say. Uh, I strongly feel there is a lot of cinematic components also and web series material on what I'm writing. It is requiring me to do a lot of research. There are certain cooked up conspiracy stories as well. Um, it talks about chemical warfare, how it started. It traces history all through. See, history and chemistry are two of my favorite subjects. When I mix up with the plot, characters, the stuff they make, it makes a nice concoction of mystery. History plus chemistry is equal to mystery. My next novel deals with that. And of course, I've done a lot of research, as I said. I was in Poland for a month and I visited the Auschwitz concentration camps. The cruelty and the horrific acts of genocide that we all know, I saw the history and the remains out of those. There are volumes of books and plethora of movies on that subject, but there are more that can be written. So that's what I'm currently writing. If you want to say that as a future. About my pen name, well, Kuhoki in Bengali means magic. Well, since I'm a wordsmith, I prefer to keep a shroud of mystery around my stories, as well as the name. So when I write short stories, I use that pen name. I have another pen name when I am writing a novel. For example, the novel that I am now writing, which will still take some time before it takes shapes to be in a publication form. So there, I will have a different pen name. So one pen name for a particular genre. I use my own name when I write essays or travel outs or more technical sort of writing. So just that three facets of my author nature. I just want to distinguish between what I write and I label them accordingly.
So one more thing. So what do you want people to know you by which name? Like Maiti or this Kuhoki? Like which name do you want it to become more famous?
I just want them to read the stories and enjoy. They don't need to remember my name.
Thank you so much. That was really a nice one.
See, I'm in this discussion in a different name, in my daughter's name. My name doesn't feature anywhere, right? So I allow it to remain totally behind the shrouds. I think that's best.
So you basically say it has to be anonymous, right?
Yeah, something around that. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
Yes, wonderful, great question, Bushra. We happy to know that there is a wordsmith who likes to remain anonymous and kind of tragic between different diverse identities. It's very
actually in this time when people want their name to be known, all over the world. I heard he wants to be anonymous while his books are there.
It's like being incognito. Being incognito has its own mysteries. Let people find out who that author is, because he jumps from one genre to another. And for example, the good thing is, see, I am hidden in all my novels. So Kuhoki means magic, right?
Absolutely.
So Souvik also means magic in some other way, right? And when I write this new novel, which I'm writing, it's written under the pen name of Ithiam Kivos. That being an international story plot, World War II, Poland and all, Russia. So I thought Ithiam Kivos is a nice name. But if you see Ithiam Kivos, if it's spelled the opposite way, it's actually Souvik Maiti. So I am hidden in all my pen names.
Absolutely. Great insight, Souvik. And thank you so much for joining us. It was wonderful talking to you. And it was a very, very insightful discussion. Thank you, Bushra, for that question as well. So that was
I thoroughly enjoyed.
Absolutely. Likewise, the pleasure is all ours. That was Souvik Maiti joining us on the past, present, and future of short stories. Without further ado, let's jump into the next session, which is going to be diametrically different and is going to be co-led with us by Sohini Bagchi. Let me introduce the distinguished panelists a little bit. Sohini is a senior journalist in the business technology domain and a published author of fiction and non-fiction books. Having nearly 2 decades of experience in journalism, content and editing, she has wielded the pen for prestigious print and digital media houses in the past. Currently, she works as chief editor with a premier IT news media house, which is aimed at business decision makers. Sohini has also completed her master's degree in communication from the Manipal Institute of Communication, Karnataka, followed by an advanced degree in human rights from Indian Institute of Human Rights, New Delhi. She's also completed a senior leadership program from the IIM Calcutta. Her recently launched book, which was incidentally published by Orange Publishers, which is titled Tectonic Shift, A Brief History of Computing and the Web, takes readers on an enlightening journey through times and presents fascinating history of the computers, the internet, and startling details on the tech industry and how it has evolved and undergone a tectonic shift over the decades. Her debut novel, which came in a few years ago, The Road to Cherry Hills, revolves around a young woman's journey of self-discovery and has received wide global acclaim. A recipient of the National Human Rights Award 2003, Sohini is also trained in karate. She enjoys reading, writing, blogging, and stargazing. She also enjoys spending quality time with her family and close friends. Warm welcome, Sohini. Impressive. It's an honor to have you on the panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your wonderful words, Shantheri.
Yes, it's a pleasure to have you here, and let's jump right into the discussion. While I have my own thoughts about the tectonic shift, I've had the pleasure and honor of having gone through the book in pretty much in-depth detail. But I would like to throw this question so that the audience also gets a feel of it. What is the book about?
Okay, so Tectonic Shift, as you rightly said, is my second book. It takes my readers on a nostalgic journey to the history of computers, right from abacus to the iPhone and more. So it talks about the early days of computers, the birth of modern internet, how computers evolved, stories behind tech legends and companies, history of women in computing, and many other tidbits on the computing history. So I should tell you how it happened. Though I've been in the tech journalism field for quite some time now, my son actually inspired me to write the book. So he kept asking questions like on early computers, tech pioneers, so who invented internet, etc., etc. And that often prompted me to look for specific answers on the internet. Though I know some, but you need to look for the specific answers. So while doing that, I found that there's a trove of information on the computer history, but they are largely scattered and written in an academic style. So that makes it a bit boring read. And that inspired me to write a book on the history of computers. So I used an interesting, some interesting trivia, facts, some startling details. Since you have gone through the book, you know, which I'm sure my readers will learn for the first time. And I deliberately kept the style very simple and free flowing so that both tech and non-tech readership can enjoy computer's splendid past. So that's the book about.
Wonderful. And I think it pretty much serves the purpose. It kind of takes even the non-tech reader through a very fascinating journey of education. There's a lot of storytelling involved. So great. Thank you for that sort of an introduction into the book. It brings me right into the core of today's discussion. So what inspired you to write this special chapter on the history of women in computing, Sohini?
That's a great question, Shantheri. So when you write a book on the history of computing, you simply cannot ignore the contribution of women in the field. And there are so many women who have significantly contributed to the field. Unfortunately, the media and history, mainstream media and history, they have largely erased women's role in the history of computing, making it an extremely male-dominated field. Personally, women in computing as a topic has always fascinated me. So women have come a long way in the workplace. However, they still make up a very small percentage of the computer and technology sector. And this number has been on a steady decline for years. So if you see today only 26% of computing jobs are held by women as per research. And the divide becomes even more prevalent at the top. Like an IBM research comes out with this, that women hold only 8% of CEO posts at tech companies and around 10% holding CIO and CTO spots. And even women of colors, I must tell you, they receive even less recognition, that they make up, say, barely 3 to 4% of the senior leadership team. And an interesting report, World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap report says that based on the current rate of progress, it will take another 100 years to achieve gender equality. However, if we look at the history of computers, despite all odds, there were women who have made a mark. Of course, life was not a bed of roses for them, but they managed to make a mark. They broke the glass ceiling and are today role models of many men and women in the computer industry. But people do not quite talk about them. So I felt there was a need to highlight that section so that, the present generation can learn from it, and even the future generation can understand, what it is all about. Everything lies in history. So unless they read the history, it is very difficult for us to, women and even men, to understand what the modern computing scenario is all about.
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, it's one of my favorite chapters too in the book, and I
Thank
think
you
that
so much.
Absolutely, because I was very fascinated, paid a lot of attention. There are about 23 to 26 ladies covered there, role models, very unconventional for their times, maybe a little more commonplace for today, but for those days, they were absolutely revolutionary, and they've made extraordinary contributions, which even women today can look up to.
Yeah.
We'll come to more on that, but that leads me to the more pertinent question in the discussion here, Sohini. I know, being technology observers, we share a common industry interest. That there is, despite all the privileges and the greater accessibility to education and opportunities in this day and age, there is still a steady decline of women in tech and in many other domains as well. But since we are putting the focus right on tech, I throw this question to you. I have my calculated guesses, of course. Why do you think there is still a steady decline of women in tech?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, Shantheri. So see, as you pointed out already, women's role was always seen as subordinate to men, and computer science, of course, was always a male-dominated field. But women had to fight against all odds, and they became pioneers. But this steady decline after a level playing field in the 1960s and 70s, around mid 1980s, women started disappearing from computer science programs at universities. So there are research which shows that while 37% of students were women during 1984-1985 school year, the number dropped drastically. So this radio show called Planet Money, they spent some time trying to understand why this happened, and they concluded that when personal computers started showing up in homes and offices, these computers were marketed and aimed exclusively at men and boys. And even after a very, the 60s and 70s were very radical times. So for feminism and many other, like it was a radical age. So after that, globally, there were campaigns to suppress women's voice that led to a lot of gender stereotypes, like boys being better at science and maths and all that. And one more reason, so that led to there was a lack of role model for women within the sector, which again led to decline because girls then often associated words like boring and difficult to computer science. And Shantheri, you are aware of the creation of the boys club and the bro culture, so which typically when men started to dominate the C-suite. So all that made it very challenging for women to stand out, and hence the steady decline.
Absolutely, absolutely. So intriguingly, when I was a part of the, the NLFs, the National NASCOM Leadership Summits and so on, some of the office bearers actually made keen observations about how people were disappearing at the mid-level. And I think it could be various societal reasons, professional reasons, sabbaticals, motherhood, a lot of things that come in. So I'll throw in a couple of quick questions to you in this context. So how does this chapter on women in computing, the history of women in computing, actually throw significance for women today, women in tech today? And if you could share some couple of interesting insights from the chapter, that would be great takeaways for our audiences.
Absolutely. That's very interesting, Shantheri. So when I was doing my research on the, the tech pioneers, the women tech pioneers, there were so many, and each of them did something unique in that field. So, for example, there's inspiration to draw from each of these women, but I do have my personal favorites, and people who are in the computer science program or even otherwise can draw inspiration from these people like Ada Lovelace. And people in the computer industry know her for, are familiar with her name for two reasons. One is she's the first computer programmer in history. Second, she was the daughter of Lord Byron and Lady Byron. But she chose a very different career choice. And though computer wasn't built during her time, her work on Charles Babbage's analytical engine and a publication later formed the foundation of the first computer that came in. And then there was Margaret Hamilton, who coined the term software engineering, which is widely used today. So another very interesting character, which I loved reading about, was Hedy Lamarr. Hedy Lamarr, we know, is the famous American actress, and she led a double life. So during the daytime, she was acting with Clark Gable and Jimmy Stewart, and in the nighttime, she was working on technology like which formed the foundation of Wi-Fi, GPS, and Bluetooth systems of today. And a nun called Kenneth Hiller. So Catholic nun. So just imagine the kind of stereotype she had to break in order to become a computer scientist and inspire hundreds of women to join STEM. So these were the things from my book, and the list is long. The list is long. For that, I would obviously request people to read the book to understand a lot of insights. And to answer the other question, which you said, how this can change the situation today. Of course, it's a basis of information. And as I told you, history is the basis of every information. So only when they read history, women in history and what they have done, and what they have done is also the foundation, it forms the basis of today's modern technology. So it will inspire more and more women to come into the tech field. Already, a lot of things are happening. The situation is changing because the governments, tech companies, educational system, and non-profits are making it happen. See, when I talk to tech companies like Accenture, IBM, Oracle, Cisco, SAP Lab, all of them basically, ThoughtWorks, so they take diversity and inclusion very seriously. So, because studies have also revealed that gender diverse groups are more productive, more creative, and successful than homogeneous groups. And of course, they're doing a lot, to encourage women to make a comeback, give them the flexibility and more opportunities. Then mentoring is another pillar of strength, encouraging more women on research, like in fields like cybersecurity, where there's already a shortage of resources. So more women can be, trained and encouraged to become leaders.
Particularly
Yes.
Sorry. Please continue.
Yeah, so these are the field, where this is what, but everything needs to be implemented. A lot of documentation happens, but companies actually need to walk the talk. So that's where I think the change should come.
Absolutely. So further to what you said, some of my conversations with the C-suite as well, with lady CIOs, the few people who have broken the boys club, as you rightly mentioned, have also spoken about being mentors. It's about the trainer concept, which kind of has to take root. And I think your book kind of some particular parts of the book, while the overall book is quite comprehensive in itself, I think these parts kind of highlight this flavor. And diversity and inclusion can be effective only when people walk the talk. I absolutely agree with you on that point. Sohini, kind of a quick sort of a thing here. Bushra has a quick question to ask you, mainly because the pandemic has now affected women in tech. We do kind of agree with that part. But there is something that she has in mind here. She wants to quickly jump in and ask you. Bushra, very quickly, please.
Yeah, as you said, women in computing, the first thing I can remember is Ada Lovelace, the first woman in computer. She was an American scientist she was the first one to come into this. So my question for you over here is, why is your book titled as The Tectonic Shift, and what is its significance? I'm eager to know about this.
Okay, that's a very interesting question, Bushra. So, tectonic shift in science and geography, we know it's the movement of the plates that make up the Earth's crust. Now, due to this movement, the Earth is in a constant state of change. Now, we all see that kind of a change happening in the world of computing. See, for example, when technology progressed from manual typewriter to automatic typewriter and to word processors. So that's a huge shift. Similarly, the landline phone, the mobile phones, and then smartphones. So these are, huge shifts happening in the world of computing. And I tell you, Bushra, one thing. Now, every shift that has evolved over the decades and centuries, they tell the story of a new way of thinking, and they transform our ways in how we approach technology. So the transformation that takes place in tech parlance, we say digital disruption, where the technology either goes bust or it reinvents itself, reaching up to the next level. And to understand all these details, I request everyone to buy a copy of that book, of my book, Tectonic Shift. Here it is with Orange Publishers, and also with Amazon and Flipkart.
So that
you understand a lot of nitty-gritties about computing history and how it has evolved and everything. So then you'll understand better the tectonic shift concept.
Absolutely. Can you just show the book a little clearly, Sohini?
Yeah. So here's the book.
Thank you. So truly a tectonic shift, in terms of disruption and revolution. Thank you, Bushra, for that question. So while we were also talking about the pandemic affecting women in tech and so on and so forth, that becomes a broad discussion. I'm very sure there's a fluidity to the way things will go, and whether the women will kind of stage a comeback in tech. Lots of questions unanswered, but I'm very sure your book raises some very pertinent questions. I would request readers to pick up the books of Souvik and Sohini. It was a wonderful discussion here with two lovely, diametrically diverse authors. And I'm very glad to have been part of this panel to co-lead this. Thanking Bushra also for joining us here. Thank you, Bushra, for your enthusiastic questions here. Yeah, it's our honor to be a part of this. Yeah, thank you, Souvik. Thank you, Sohini. So on behalf of Orange Publishers, signing off from the Delhi Book Fair 2021. Hope to have more discussions on this in future. Please stay tuned to our books as well as to what we have to offer. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.